So this assignment is money questions regarding bank expansions and specifically what are called banking balance sheets. And so these banking balance sheets are a piece of the puzzle how AP is going to approach asking these questions to you on AP exam. They might end up being like word problem type questions, but they could end up being in the form of bank balance sheets instead. And so for our purposes, let's remind that all of these banks are going to be fully loaned out. That means that all of their monies are that they want to lend are lent. And then when we're looking at the T-chart, we have to add something here. We have to put demand deposits for each and every one of these on the side because that's a typo that they are not there. So when we're looking at this, then we have assets and liabilities. And in this scenario, then what are we seeing here? The question solely is, what is the reserve requirement? The reserve requirement is a fancy way of saying what is the reserve ratio. The ratio is that number set by the Fed that determines the amount of money that has to be on site at all times. And this is always going to be a percentage. And so in this scenario, then the bank has $10 in demand deposits under liabilities. This is what the bank has to pay out. That's what the bank owes. And over here under assets, this is what the bank owns. So the bank has $5 in required reserves. That's what that RR means, required reserves. So if the bank has $5 in required reserves and $10 in demand deposits, that means the bank is holding 50% on site. That must mean that the answer to this question is 50%. See, the reserve requirement is a function of the demand deposit. That means what percentage of demand deposits have to stay on site. And so in this case, the bank is holding half. That must mean that the ratio is 50%. Doing the same problem looking at number 2, what is the reserve requirement? The bank is holding 5 of 20 on site. Remember, these are all demand deposits. 5 required of 20 means the bank is holding 1/4. See, 5 goes in 4 times, so that means it's 1/4. So that means it's 1/4 or 25%. See, this is why the whole unit is really referred to as what is called fractional banking. The idea of fractional banking is the idea that the bank has to keep a specific percentage on site, and then the rest the bank can loan out. Continuing number 2, why is this bank less profitable than it could be? The answer is they have extra money sitting on site. See, ER means excess reserves. And remember, excess reserves are a fancy way of saying loanable funds. See, this here and then this again here, and then even down here where it says loans, these are contracts. These are dollars that are stuck. And for the purpose of our problems, we always ignore the loan because that money is set. The bank doesn't get to change those numbers. When we do a problem like this, we're only really looking at the reserves and the liabilities and trying to reconcile the chart. Looking at what we have going on here, why is this bank less profitable than it could be? Well, the answer is it's holding cash. And why would a bank hold cash? You see, it has $5 in excess reserves it could lend. Because remember, excess reserves are a fancy way of saying loanable funds. It could lend that $5, but it's choosing not to. That's actually why it's considered more secure, because it's holding cash. The reason that the bank would most likely be holding cash is because they have to worry about what is called daily transaction demand. And what that means is on any given day, the bank is going to have customers that walk in the door and they have to have enough money to meet the needs of their customers and still meet that required reserve ratio. And so the bank is worried about having customers walk in. That means they're going to hold extra cash for what is called daily transaction demand. Number 3. Number 3 says, what is the reserve requirement? Looking at the scenario, remember we have $40 in demand deposits. The bank is currently holding 10 out of 40. And so 10 out of 40, because we always use demand deposits and the required reserves, means that we're holding 1/4 again. That means that yet again, this is going to be a 25%. Remember, the reserve requirement is the amount of money that has to be held on site, and it is a function of demand deposits. And so if a T-chart gives us the required reserves and the demand deposits, then we can easily determine the reserve requirement. Letter B, says the $40 in deposits enables the banking system to increase the total money supply by how much? This is a system question. When we get a system question, we have to remember that we have to use the multiplier. And so the change in the money supply is going to equal the money multiplier times, in this case, they use the money for a bond, so we're going to multiply it by that bond. In this case, then, that means that we have to find the money multiplier and multiply it by the bond. Now, the money multiplier, let's just go to the back and do the quick math here. The money multiplier equals the ratio under the number 1. And so 1 divided by the ratio equals the money multiplier. In this case, then, we determined that the ratio, reserve required ratio, is 25%. So that means that this is going to be 1 divided by 25%. Now, technically, you can't do that. You have to convert that to a decimal. 1 divided by 0.25. How many times does 25 cents go into a dollar? The answer is 4. So this multiplier is something you have to be able to find for every problem like this. And in this case, then, the money multiplier is 4. The value of the bond was 30. So 4 times 30 is $120. That's the amount of dollars that are going to be cycled through the economy as a result. So number 3, letter C, a withdrawal of $5 in cash or check from this bank would do what to the amount that should, by Federal Reserve requirement rule, be in the reserves? So I'm going to rewrite this one on the back for the purpose of this problem. So for the purpose of this problem, what we see is that we had assets and they had 10 in reserve. I think it was 10. It was 10. And then we had 40 in deposits. And then there was another $30 bond. But remember, a bond is a contract. That's going to stay out there forever. And so here's the deal, what they just said happened. They said Bob the guy shows up and Bob the guy wants to withdraw money. Now, remember the way banks work is if people want to withdraw money from the bank, then we have to give them their money. That is factually the way it is. And so in this instance, then what we have to do is do exactly what the problem says. First, we have to give the money. We have to give the money to the customer. That means that this is going to be subtracted by 5, leaving only 35 in demand deposits. Now, see, here's the trick of a balance sheet. The assets must always equal the liabilities. And now 35 no longer equals 40. So we have to, if we subtract on one side, we have to subtract on the other. And in this instance, then we have to pull the money from our required reserves. And so because you can't go into the bond, that's a contract. It can't be changed. So we're going to subtract that 5 there, meaning that this bank now has 5 in required reserves. So now 35 does equal 35. So we are balanced, but we're not necessarily reconciled yet. Now we have to make sure that all the money is in the correct spot. See, in this problem, we said that the reserve ratio was 25%. That means the required reserve has to be 25% of 35. So we have to see, is this number correct? And the answer is no, it's not. And so looking at this 35, 10% would be 3.5. So 20% is going to be 7. 5 would be another $1.75. That means that we have $8.75 that has to be held on site. That's 25% of 35. So the required reserves are supposed to be $8.75, but the bank only has 5. So this bank has a shortfall. The question said, what do the amount that should be the federal, what would that do to the amount that should be held? That's what this is saying. Well, the answer is the bank now is required to hold $8.75 because that's 25% of 35. The bank has a shortage of money, and since we're here, we might as well just mention this. What does a bank do in this scenario? This bank is going to have to get a loan from another bank. What this bank will do is they'll call another bank and say, hey, I only have $5, but I'm supposed to have $8.75. Can I borrow $3.75 from you? And the bank will say yes, they always do, and they will borrow on what is called an overnight loan, and they will pay them the interest rate that's referred to as the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate one bank charges another for a loan. So this bank is supposed to have $8.75, but they only have 5. That means that they're going to have to borrow $3.75, and they'll pay the federal funds interest rate on top of that $3.75 when they borrow it overnight. That's if they borrow from another bank. They could instead of borrowing from another bank, they could borrow from the Fed. And if they called the Fed instead, they would pay the discount rate. And this is what you pay when you borrow from the Fed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is one interest rate and this is another. These are the two backbone interest rates that you're going to have to know. Which one will a bank choose? Well, that's easy. They'll go whichever one is lower. What would you rather pay, 5% or 4%? Yes, please, 4%. And so that's what they'll do. They'll do the federal funds rate. So the answer one more time to number C, what happens to the reserve requirement? The answer is it changes from 10 to 875. All right. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at number 4. So this one just jumps straight into the mumbo jumbo. Now this is what an AP question is going to look like. This number 4 is our best question on the sheet. And so looking at what we have here, the first thing it asks is a deposit of $50 goes into the bank. What would this do to reserves? Okay, so our demand deposits are currently 100 and somebody just deposited an additional 50. What that means is that we have to add 50 to the demand deposit side. And so when we add that 50, this becomes 150 in demand deposits. Now, 150 is greater than 100. That means when we add to this side, we have to add to this side. So now we have to put in that $50 over here. That means this bank is now going to have $60 in reserves. I'm just going to write reserves of 60. But the question is, where does it go? Is it all required? Is it all excess? Whatever it's going to be. In order to answer this, then, we have to look at this original number. We have to see what the required reserve ratio is. Looking at those original numbers, 10 of 100 means that the ratio, I'm just going to write kind of a letter E here for fun, the ratio equals 10% because the bank is currently holding 10 of 100. 10 of 100 equals 1/10. That's 10%. So I know that when a new $50 comes into the bank, this is new money, that a certain percentage of it will have to be held on site and a certain percentage of it they're going to be able to loan. And so in this instance, then, we have 150 now in demand deposits, and our required reserves used to be 10. Well, now they're 15 because $150 in demand deposits means 10% of that is going to be 15. So $50 in new money came in. 5 has to be held on site. That leaves us with $45 out of that 50, which now become what are called excess reserves. And then, of course, this bank still has that old $90 loan. Remember, that's a contract, and so that's not going to change at all. It stays right where it's at. We can ignore, when it says contract, we can more or less ignore it. So see, here's what I did then. I added the 50 on this side because it was 100, right? I added the 50 on this side. And when you add on this side, you got to add on this side. It used to be 10 and 0 excess reserves. We can see that there. That's what it was. And so now it's going to be 15 and 45 because when the new $50 came in, they have to hold 10% of it on site, which was $5. But then the remainder of that 50 is 45. These are what we call loanable funds. And then these loanable funds, then the bank is holding as reserves, but they're going to try to lend it as fast as they can. So what we just did is we just did what was called reconciling the balance sheet. The 100 became 150. We were no longer balanced. So we threw the 60 on there, and now it was balanced, right? But then we had to reconcile where the money goes. And then this up here became this down here. This is the proper answer to letter A. What would this do to the reserves? Letter B says this deposit of $50 would enable the bank to make how many dollars of loans? Well, I already solved that. This is $45. Oops, and I wrote a percentage there. It's $45. Here, I'll just rewrite that. It's $45 because of the 50, 5 had to be held on site because that was the reserve ratio. And then of the 50, 5 is held on site. That means there's 45 left. That's loanable funds. Letter C says this deposit of $50 would enable the banking system to increase loans by how much? Well, the change, because this is a system question, the change in money supply is going to equal the excess reserve times the money multiplier. And so that equals 45 times the money multiplier. We got to find that money multiplier. So just kind of making some space here, the money multiplier equals 1 divided by the ratio. That's 1 divided by 10%. That equals 1 divided by 0.1. So how many times does 10 cents go into a dollar? That's 10. So the money multiplier is 10. So this deposit then is going to do how much? The answer is $450. This equals $450. That's how much the money supply is going to grow. Letter D, what happens to a loan when a loan is repaid? Well, this is easy enough. Bob, the guy, shows up with his $90 loan and he pays them cash. So it's no longer a loan. The contract is paid out. This 90 then gets added to the excess reserves because it was just paid off. That's what happens. When a loan gets paid off, the bank then can immediately lend out the money. What happens? Well, we just have to reconcile the sheet. We scratch it out of the loans and then we add it to the excess reserves. And so technically that would mean that we have 135 in excess reserves now. If you do the math on that, 135 plus 15 is 150. 150 does equal 150. So see, we're still balanced. We're still in business. And this is what we call a banking balance sheet.